Ladies and gentlemen, I am Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It is October 2nd, 2022. This is your daily Ukraine update, and we are going to be asking just what can Russia do to stabilize its losing positions. Let's get into it. So, the biggest news is, as you guys can see, Russian forces have either completed their withdrawal from Lyman, as Russia claims, or been completely eliminated from positions in Lyman. I actually think it's probably a combination of the two. Almost certainly, based on information like this is a situation in which Russia is largely too late to be able to totally withdraw its troops. There are some very limited stories that are really hard to confirm about this road to Crimea being a sort of shooting gallery like we talked about, but it's hard to confirm those things. But as you can see, as we advance through the day yesterday, Russia beats a hasty withdrawal and Ukraine continues to advance. What's interesting to me is that, again, you have this natural defensive barrier right here formed by these man-made reservoirs near Yampolivka. And their logic dictates, though reality on the ground gets a vote, that someone like Russia would want to use this natural obstacle as sort of an anchor for future defensive lines. Of course, it may simply not have the tools or manpower to establish meaningful defensive positions here in Zarichne, and that alone could have just spurred the call they seem to have made to give up this position here and try to establish a defensive line in this area, though this is basically an empty space a few kilometers away from this reservoir, and it's not clear that there's any special reason they would draw in here. This is probably just the current line of contact, but I would expect to see continued Russian retreats. Maybe they will attempt to use perhaps this highway here as a sort of defensive line. It's not clear that will do that. This is really a sufficient geography either. When we look to the north, we can also see that Ukrainian forces have continued to expand this existing bridgehead now that Davorichna and Kupiansk bridgeheads have been connected. You can see that they are concentrating their forces on pushing this line out here, and as we've discussed, potentially running the same sort of encirclement playbook at Borova. It would be a little tougher just because there's not a natural geography that sort of facilitates that. But as we've seen, Russia can't really stabilize its lines, and it seems almost like wherever Ukraine chooses to push, Russians will fall back. So as you can imagine, the Russian mill bloggers and the Russian, pro-Russian military space is in full seethe and cope mode. So obviously broken down by the Institute for the Study of War, who does a pretty good job of following these Russian mill bloggers. And, they are a really loud voice to someone like Putin. They represent perhaps the sentiments of his strongest base in the Russian population, right? There's a lot of people that don't like him, but it's important the people that do continue to like him, right? You don't need everyone to like you, but you really need your core supporters to remain your core supporters. And this is sort of the problem I think he's running into, is that a lot of these ultra-nationalists are pretty pissed, right? They are mad at the Russian military command's failure to send reinforcements in a timely manner and criticizing the bureaucratic failures during mobilization. Now, I'm not sure. I imagine it's probably a little of A, a little of B, the bureaucratic failures, that mobilization is both going very slowly and is plagued with errors. And one of the things we talked about, right, is that manpower is not just manpower. If you are recruiting someone who's very old, very ill, or just like totally untrained, they are a liability to a combat unit. If you're a combat commander on the ground and you're receiving these sort of troops, you probably aren't going to be able to put them to use. You will have to train them on the ground. But realistically, again, if I was one of these commanders, I would probably sit there and tell them politely but firmly to turn around and go home and finish their training. Civilians on the battlefield are a complicating factor, and regardless of whether you put them in a Russian military uniform or not, without military training, they are just civilians. They're going to eat your soldiers' food. They're going to shoot ammo that someone who knows how to operate a weapon could otherwise use. They're going to eat your water, drink your water, and they are going to become casualties that then your well-trained soldiers are going to have to treat, taking them off the battlefield as well. Of course, the commentators are holding out that this partial mobilization will generate enough force to resume offensive operations, which would be possible in an environment in which they push harder for appropriate training, right? What should happen, if Russia is smart, they will find a defensive position. They will dig into that defensive position, and they will hope that the winter itself is going to slow offensive operations enough that they could spend the winter training their conscripts, and that's who they're going to get, untrained conscripts, and will get them to the front to resume offensive operations in the spring. But the problem is, of course, the Ukrainians will do the same thing, and the Ukrainian military probably can generate combat power a lot faster because basically it has the entirety of NATO equipping it. But it's not a it's not a good strategy. Russia doesn't have good strategies, right? It's exhausted all the good ideas, and now it has only bad ideas available to it. Ryan Macbeth, another YouTube analyst, called it dilemmas, not problems, where there's only bad solutions. Chechen leader Kadyrov is apparently so worked up about it that he's urging Russia to continue to fight to liberate the four territories with all means available, including low-yield nuclear weapons. Kadyrov's sort of an idiot and a wannabe tough guy who doesn't really think that hard about what he says and what he's doing. And that's why Russia loves him, right? He's never going to be a threat to Putin because he's literally not sophisticated enough to do it. But what's interesting is, of course, the Institute for the Study of War points out that when you use a nuclear weapon, you irradiate the ground. And while it's possible for militaries to operate in those environments, the U.S. military, right, we classically have what we call MOP gear, and we have decontamination procedures and whole units dedicated to cleaning and allowing tactical operations to move through contaminated environments. Russia almost certainly doesn't have that, and it would probably just irradiate and kill a lot of their soldiers if they tried to use a low-yield nuclear weapon on a tactical or operational objective. Anyway, guys, that is all I had for you for today. Thanks so much for joining me. Of course, if you want to see the combat video breakdowns that are just too spicy for YouTube, become a member of the Patreon. Thanks to my Lieutenant tier patrons. And be sure to check out our sponsor, ground.news. Most videos, I do use them. They're a great way to discern the bias in reporting and see how a story is covered across the political spectrum. Link to all that stuff is in the description. I'll see you in the next one.